Thank you. So this story I found in one of the earliest magazines of the National Storytelling Network. It was the National Association of Preservation and Perpetuation of Storytelling. And they would often have short stories, several paragraphs, inside a little frame in the magazine on the bottom half of a page. And this is where I heard this story. There was once a gentleman who was walking on a beach, and if you'd seen him that day, you would have noticed his hair was really dry, like he maybe hadn't washed it for a while. And his clothes were a little scruffy, a little threadbare. And as he walked on the beach, he began to notice a woman who was seated on a blanket, not in the water, but near where the water waves were coming up. And he approached her, said good morning, and she greeted him, and she invited him to sit with her. And they sat and they introduced themselves to each other and they spoke. They talked a little bit about their lives and about the weather and about the water. And one of the things the fellow noticed was that the woman was wearing a beautiful ring. It had an amethyst stone and it was quite large. And he noticed it and he said something about it to her. And she said, yes, this has been a very important piece in my life. It's brought me a lot of comfort and healing. And she said, and she took it off her finger and she gave it to the young man. And she said, go ahead and put it on and see how it fits. And it fit quite well. And he said, well, thank you. And she said, enjoy it. And when he got up to leave after some more conversation, she watched him as he walked down the beach. And then she went back to reading a book that she had. So she was quite surprised when she turned and saw that he was coming back to her. And when he got up close, he had pulled the ring off his finger. And he said, you know, I really appreciate that you gave me this ring, but there's actually something I want more than that. And so, and she said, what? I don't quite understand. And he said, well, I want, what I want is the thing that you have that enabled you to give this to me. So hats off to John. Welcome to Regional Gem Nest.
Good stories.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Before you go, I have a question. Do you take requests, and can you tell the fountain story next time?
The fountain.
Water fountain.
Magic Penny Boy?
Yes.
Yes, that requires a washboard and standing up. You
Standing.
know, I could tell that at Telebration.
Oh, that would
Yeah,
be wonderful.
yeah.
That was the first one I heard you tell, and I loved it.
Well, I could tell it at Telebration, but it takes about 17 minutes, John.
Well, we can do it.
So, but I'd rather do it in person with washboard than on Zoom.
Okay.
Okay, maybe I could shorten up a couple of the songs. All right, thanks for the request.
All right.
Story.
Do we have anybody else on Zoom that has a story? Don't think so. So now I'm going to change the spotlight to here and move the chair around. Who wants to be first?
I do not.
I can. Okay, Nick will be first. And we'll position this, and it looks like right here, you're not too much taller than me. You should.
That looks good.
Well, we have marks on the wall.
Oh. Well, it depends on how tall.
We can say,
Project a little.
yes. I rarely tell this story, but this is the right time of year, and I want to tell the story behind the story. When I was a kid, there was a particular short story author whose work I just fell in love with as soon as I started reading things that were really written for adults. His name was Manly Wade Wellman, and he was not only a writer of stories, but he was a collector of folk tales and songs, especially out of different parts and different cultures of America. And so he wrote a bunch of stories that I just absolutely adored. And then later on, I ran across this particular story and realized that I was in correspondence with his wife because I was working on a magazine and both of them were still writing by then. Unfortunately, his health was very poor and he passed away before I could get an answer about how much of this particular story came from his research into the songs and stories. So I never found out for sure where the ideas for this came from as compared to his other tales. But his others were just amazing blends of folklore, especially from the American South. Now, Ransom Cuff was about the meanest man you ever saw. To give you an idea how mean he was, nobody ever just called him Ransom because that would have been a sign of friendship, and Ransom Cuff had no friends. And nobody ever called him Mr. Cuff because that would have been a sign of respect, and nobody respected him. Even his wife called him Ransom Cuff. But the fact was that everybody, for miles round, owed him money. And my family did too, which is why I was working for him as his boatman. Now, why would he need a boatman? Well, you see, the only thing that Ransom Cuff really enjoyed was hunting frogs. Now, some folks would do that because that's how you get the freshest frog legs. So you make the finest stuff out of them. But the fact was, what Ransom Cuff really enjoyed was the way you hunt them. See, you go out in a boat and you go to where the frogs are, and you get this little three-pointed spear, a trident they call it. And you reach into the water and you stab that frog and you lift it up out of the water and put it in your croaker sack. And well, that's what most folks did. But Ransom Cuff, he stabbed those frogs, especially the big old bullfrogs, and lifted them up clean out of the water and would just watch them die and then put them into the bag. That's the kind of man he was. I wasn't the only one working for him. There was this old Indian from one of the tribes that never left the swamp when they were supposed to, because they never surrendered like they were supposed to. And technically, they're still at war all these years later. But he knew every part of every piece of water in that swamp. And so when Ransom Cuff wanted to hunt the best, biggest frogs, he would have that Indian guide him, and I would take the boat wherever he wanted, and he would come back with his bag full of frogs and his dinner of frog legs. Well, one night, that moon was as full and bright as it was if it was a big old torch up in the sky. And Ransom Cuff said, "This is a good night to go hunting frogs." So the Indian and I, we got into the boat and we started moving out into the water. Well, normally you hear the frogs in all directions. You just go toward one of the clusters where the frogs are. There'll be the little peepers and the big old bulls, and you'll hear the different sounds of them in all different directions. But this night, it was as if they were all off in one direction. And Ransom Cuff, he said, "Sounds like we got to go over that way." And that Indian, he said, "No, we cannot go that way. That is the place of the Father. It is a holy place. We cannot go there." Ransom Cuff said, can't tell me where to go. You and your Indian superstitions, I want to go there. You're going to guide me there or you're going to swim home. Now, that swamp water was full of snakes and gators and who knows what else, but that Indian, he didn't think a second before he jumped out of the boat and started swimming. Well, I didn't know what to do except when Ransom Cuff said, "You two, you take me to where those frogs are." Well, I sure didn't want to swim back from there. So I guided the boat as he said. Without the engine, it took twice as long because I had to go around routes and through places that I didn't know anything about. But there was this sort of big open space there in the swamp. Water with the moon shining off of it so bright. And it sounded like there were thousands upon thousands of frogs in all directions, all singing away. And Ransom Cuff, he looked and said, "This is great. Let me find me a big old bullfrog." But he looked around and he looked around. He said, "Just over to the left there. That's where they are. I see some." And I drifted the boat on over the direction he said. Now, I was busy because it felt like the boat was scraping on something and I wanted to make sure we didn't get caught. So I was looking over the side and heard a funny noise from up front where Ransom Cuff was. It was kind of like a, ah. Well, I looked up and he was leaning way over the side of the boat. I couldn't tell how he wasn't falling out of the boat. And then I could see why. There was something holding him up. And he sort of rose up out of the boat a little bit. And I could see that coming up out of the water was this big old rod that split into three forks, like a trident. And it looked as if that was sticking into Ransom Cuff's front. And he sort of drifted out of the boat over the open water and sank down into it. Now, there are folks that would say that I should have done something to help him, but to be honest, nobody in town would have. And besides that, I didn't want to face whatever it was that had done that to it. So I backed that boat out of there real careful and went all the way back to the docks, back at the town. And don't you know that engine was already there? And I said, "What the heck was that out there?" And I told him about what had happened to Ransom Cuff, and he laughed. "You found the place of the Father, yes. Now you know I would not take you there. It was a holy place." And I said, "What kind of holy place do you Indians have?" And he said, "No, that is not a holy place of my people or of yours. That is the place of Kungabazi. He is the father of frogs." Well, I went back into town and spread the word that Ransom Cuff had come to an unpleasant end in the swamp. The sheriff, he congratulated me and said he wouldn't press charges. And I said, "No, I didn't do it." And by morning, I had 2 marriage proposals and a French pie on my porch. But the fact was that he was gone and didn't come back. And sad to say, everyone was better for it. It was, like I said, it was one of the stories that Walter wrote about. And he wrote the most amazing stories over his career. And many of them were based on folk songs and folk tales and folklore. He was in North Carolina for many years near Chapel Hill, and he was, among other things, a song catcher. And there was a musician in Arizona who finally did an album of some of his versions of folk songs, and it was just amazing to hear these.
What was his name again?
Manly Wade Wellman.
Okay.
And he was just a remarkable writer. For about 50 years, he wrote stories. One of them even got made into a Twilight Zone episode. The one, if you ever saw those Still Valley, the one about the Civil War place where nothing was happening, that was based on one of his stories. And there was a really bad movie based on some of his other stories, but that's another story. But yeah, he was just a wonderful writer, and he and his wife were both writers for many, many years.
It is awesome.
Oh, really?
Are they really?
I was told that you could make it so that they're not to use.
Well, they creep out of their head,
Right,
so you have to. be careful.
right.
Yeah,
But the
like if
legs.
your
I was-
hand touched.
There's another discussion going on here. Jane said bullfrog.
Well, if you eat it.
But it's
Folks
creeps
do.
right behind their ears.
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
So you just don't eat their heads.
No, you only eat the legs.
Okay.
Okay.
My take his daughter with him, and they put a frog in it. And we take the frogs and set it on the top of the lake top, throw the rest in the water, and they would sit there.
Yeah.
We can't hear anything.
Yeah,
Uh,
You want to hear that?
yeah, you didn't want to hear that. It was kind of disgusting. All right, so who wants to be next? Me? All right, go ahead, Ron. You go.
Those of you who moved in last month heard me, they know that I created a story about shape-shifting trolls. Okay, and I've been working on it quite a bit. Okay, and I want to tell it at Celebration, but I'm not sure where to cut things out to get it in the time limits, and it hasn't settled in yet. So I want to tell it as often as I can between now and November. Trolls. These days, people talk by the dark. These days, when people think of trolls, they think of people who create false identities for themselves on internet activities and use them to cheat people, deceive people, spread lies, and similar such behavior. But of course, there used to be trolls. And trolls have interesting characteristics. The ones that had more than one head are long gone, for they could not take the shape of a human safely. But the other kind, the ones that hid under bridges or those kinds of places, they still exist. There's some things about trolls that are universal. Trolls are greedy beyond anyone's comprehension. A troll will acquire almost anything and keep it hidden away if it has any remote value, or even if it doesn't. Trolls often interact with people, but they never really care about the people they interact with. And trolls' great power is their ability to take over other creatures' lives. But they can only do that dark of the moon, and only in contact with a large piece of granite. This particular troll still thought of himself as his original human name, Phineas. But of course, that was 4 identities ago. He had done quite well for himself. He had acquired gold and land and properties, and his problem was that the community where he's in began to notice he just wasn't aging very much. Oh, he did what he could with makeup and costuming and whatnot to go older, but it was obvious he had to find a new identity. And modern life has made that very difficult for a troll. He has gold and he tries to sell it. Where did it come from? Did you pay taxes on it? Where are your records? The same thing for other material possessions. He had beautiful works of art that were worth a great deal of money that he didn't have any way to trade or sell. And he was growing too old, without growing older. And people were beginning to look at him strangely in the community he was in. So he began to try and figure out some way to acquire a new identity that would allow him some of his wealth to go with him and maybe transfer more in without anybody asking too many questions over a course of time. He didn't have any ideas for a while, and then he heard about a very fortunate event. There was a young man who had, in his youth, often visited the house of an uncle. And a peasant, but he hadn't been back in many years, and his own parents had died, and he was sort of half raised by the village he was in, city he was in. He was a football player and quite popular, and he got the word that his uncle had died and he was going to inherit the estate and any of its property. Now, this was a long way from where he lived, and he didn't have much money, and he wasn't sure how he was going to get to where he needed to present himself. A long bus ride, but that's good. Now, Johnson still stepped in. He said to him, John, I've got some property out the direction you need to go to and a few places I need to check on. And if you want to travel with me, I'll drive you where you need to be. Well, of course, riding in his Mr. Johnson's Cadillac and staying in nice motels and eating in nice restaurants was vastly better idea than traveling by bus or train or whatever. And so the young man agreed. And off they went. Mr. Johnson, he did indeed visit different places that he needed to be at, but what he was really doing was watching the calendar, because he needed to be at one particular property that he had had for many years and hadn't been back to, that was ideal for what he wanted to do. And so he watched the calendar, and when it was the day before the dark of the moon, he said, I got one more place to stop. We're not that far from where you're going, Pleasantville, but we're going to spend one more night away. And he drove him up a back road, high into the mountains, and up to a place with, well, the place looked okay. I mean, it was kind of ramshackle, but it wasn't that bad. And he said, yeah, this is the place, We'll spend the night here. He said, they did.
It was made for a cheap cell phone or one of those 99-cent shops. No GPS. Exactly.
Mr. Johnson.
What we could do is locate the cell tower where it last pinged, but that only gives us an area.
One of his hands grew larger and stronger and hard as stone, and he grabbed a hold of the young sleeping man and said, you're coming with me. Oh, he begged, he pleaded, he tried to break away, but the thing next to him, which he now realized wasn't quite human, was far too powerful for him. The troll dragged him up the side of the mountain and got onto a large piece of granite. And then he literally ripped his clothes off of him, forced him down to the ground, and somehow hard rock just sort of closed up over one foot. Then the troll stood up, carefully removed his own clothing, and began to change into the troll. Oh, it had normal arms and legs, only fatter and stronger and far rougher. But the biggest change was its head. Its human face began to shift and change. Its neck grew longer. Its nose grew longer. Its jaw grew longer and longer and longer and longer until it looked more like an elephant's trunk than a human mouth. And it approached the young man who was still pleading for his life. And the last thing Jonathan saw was that mouth approaching his ear. It took the rest of that dark of the moon night for the troll to completely absorb all of his body parts, all of his interests, all of his memories, all of his things that he could do. And then, as dawn broke in the mountains, he slowly turned back into an exact replica of young John. Left on the top of the boulder was tiny grains of granite sand, very smooth, maybe closer to dust in some cases. But now Jonathan, the young man, took the other young man's regular clothing, put it on, used his identity papers, drove into the wonderful town of Pleasantville. Pleasantville was the ideal place for anybody who wasn't a troll to live. They had 4 major church organizations in town who had years and years before decided that either on the first Sunday or the first Saturday, depending upon their faith, they would sponsor a community event at the big park. And every church tried to do better than the last one. And the events were wonderful, and everybody looked forward to the first weekend of every year, and nobody seemed to be having any problems. A troll can't stand happy people. It just runs counter to their nature for people to be happy unless they are happy because they're worshiping the troll. And so the troll began to scheme. Of course, he had wealth from his uncle, and he brought more wealth in. And he kept thinking, how can I get people to think about me and not about the wonderful community they live in? Other places have done religion, but that won't work here at all. And I can't see race working here. We got a little bit of everybody, and all of those people interact very well together every first Saturday or Sunday year round, and they all seem to be involved in each other's lives. And that won't work either. Race won't work. Religion won't work. What can I do? What can I do that will cause people to be suspicious of someone? I'm gentle, of course, just gentle rumor. But he noticed that there was one rather large family that was at all of the events, and they were a little different. They had red hair, and some of them had green eyes. And he thought, that's it. They're physically different. They may be like everyone, but that won't work. That won't save them from me. And he began to spend money in town to make himself more popular. He built some new things. He remodeled some things. He talked to the people about all the things going on in their communities. And then he began to spread rumors about green-eyed, red-haired people who were just a little off. Their lives, the people picked on, began to go sideways. They couldn't understand why people who had been their friends for years, seemed to be pulling away from them, and they couldn't think of any reason why this would be happening. And they sort of closed in on themselves for self-protection, staying more clannish, which made them more different. And then the troll began his real campaign. He began to whisper about the adults and children and the grandchildren. And people sometimes would say, but this family has been in our valley for 100 years. But that didn't matter. Not to this kind of rumor, not this kind of mystery, underhanded, sneaky phrases. Now they had a child in their group, a handsome young man, very bright, liked science a lot, who had the habit of going out at night to watch the stars and chart locations, and he would take long walks after most people were in bed. He was out one night, not far from the troll's house, when he saw the troll walking out into the distance. And he thought, where would a man walk at this time of night? So curious, he followed at a distance, not wanting to interfere with whatever the man was doing. The man climbed and climbed up the side of a hill, found a leftover granite boulder dropped by a glacier some centuries before. And he climbed up on the top and took off his clothes and lay down. The young man was mystified, but he didn't want to come any closer. He just knew something weird had happened. It wasn't until he was thinking about it the next day that he realized I'd gone out there because it was the dark of the moon, and I could have seen, thinking of different constellations he would have looked at. Life continued. Another month came around, and this young man decided it was the dark of the moon. Will he do it again? So he bravely went out and followed Johnson, his journey. And he got closer this time. And he saw him remove his clothing, lay down on the bare rock, and slowly turn into stone himself. All in human shape, mind you, but something weird about his head. Now he was frightened, but he didn't know what to do. He thought about it that whole next month, and then he went to his uncle and said, "This is what I saw. I don't know what it means." He looked at him and said, "Well, you are a good kid. Hey, if this is what you say you saw, I'll go with you tonight." So he did. He went to so he'd go with him. He said, "If this is dangerous, I don't think we should go alone." So he spoke to his brother, and he spoke to his father. And the young men and the grown men and the old man followed this creature out on the glacier rock. And they saw him take off his human clothing, lay down on the rock, and begin to transition into a strange looking, somewhat human form. And they rushed forward, and looked at what was there and thought, this is too dangerous to be allowed to live. And they grabbed up stones and tools that they brought with them and crushed this creature before it could make its full transition. And then they waited, not knowing what to expect, till dawn. And when the first ray of sunlight touched what used to be the troll, it disintegrated into sand, and some of it as fine as dust. So if you happen to go to Pleasantville, wherever it may be, and you see a community still very much involved with each other, you'll see a small statue of a young man whose courage and determination had saved them all and taught them that just because a troll says something doesn't make it true.
Thank you, Ron. That was great. Did you make a lot of changes? Because it seemed pretty much the same.
It's pretty close to the same. I added some details to the absorption, and I still need another name because I used Jonathan as the victim, and then I didn't have a name for the young man who was the science student, and I left it out. So I've got to have a name there. But other than that, I think this is pretty much close to what I'm going to do. So,
Yeah. Okay.
It's great.
Great original story. With a message.
Mm-hmm.
Barbara, do you want to be next? Are you going to tell a story tonight? You have one, Jane? Well, I do. I have a Norse folk tale called "The Lad That Went to See the North Wind." Long time ago, there was a boy whose name was Leif. And he lived with his mother on a small farm, and they were very poor. But they got by somehow. And one day, Leif went out to the barn where they stored their flour. and he had a bowl and he filled it up, and walking back from the barn towards the house, the north wind came up and blew the flour out of the bowl. Well, the boy was furious, but he had to go get the flour. So he went back in, filled up the bowl again, and again, the wind blew the flour away, and he kept trying until all the flour was gone. And so he went and told his mother what happened. The north wind blew away all our flour. I'm going to go see the north wind and ask for the north wind to give it back to us. And so the next day, bright and early, he set off, and he walked and he walked and he walked and he walked all day long until finally he found the north wind. And the north wind said, "Why have you come to see me?" And Leif said, "Well, you blew away all our flour, and we're very poor. Give us the flour back, please." And the north wind said, "I don't have your flour, but I do have a magic tablecloth." "Well, what good is that?" said Leif. "Oh, all you have to do is spread it out on the table and say, 'Cloth, give me food,' and it'll give you as much food as you can possibly eat." So he took the cloth, started back home, but it was starting to get dark. He needed to find a place to stay, and he saw this inn. And he went into the inn, and the innkeeper greeted him. And the boy said, "I need a place to spend the night, but I don't have any money, but I can give you some food in payment." And the innkeeper said, "Well, I suppose that might work." And so the boy went to a table that was in the inn, and he put that tablecloth on it, and he said, "Cloth, give me food." And instantly the table was filled with food, and the boy started eating and invited the innkeeper over to eat, and that worked out quite well for payment for the night's lodging. Well, the innkeeper noticed that that was a magic tablecloth, and he wanted it for himself. So that night, while the boy was asleep, the innkeeper snuck into his room, and he took the magic tablecloth and put another one in its place. So the next morning, when Leif woke up, he took the tablecloth and he went home and told his mother that he didn't get the flour, but he got something even better, a magic tablecloth. And she said, "Show me." And so he put the tablecloth on the table, and he said, "Cloth, give me food." Nothing happened because it wasn't the magic table. And the mother said, "It doesn't work." And Leif said, "It doesn't work. I'm going to go back to the north wind tomorrow and ask for our flour." So first thing in the morning, Leif got up and he walked and he walked and he walked until finally he found the north wind. And he said, "You blew our flour away, and then you gave me a magic tablecloth that worked once, but then never worked again. Please give me the flour back." And the north wind said, "Well, I don't have your flour, but I have something else that you can use. It's a magic coin purse. And there's a gold coin in it. And when you take the gold coin out, another one will appear, and it will never be empty." And so Leif said, "Oh, thank you very much." And again, it got late, and he stopped at that same inn. And the innkeeper said, "Well, welcome back. I want you to pay now." And the boy said, "Okay." And he turned the bag upside down, and the gold coin dropped down. And the innkeeper said, "It'll be 2." And he turned it upside down again, and another coin fell out. "Thank you." And the innkeeper surmised that this was a magic coin purse that always had some money in it. And so that night, while Leif was asleep in his room, the innkeeper snuck in. He stole the magic coin purse, put another coin purse in its place. And the next morning, when Leif woke up, he went back home and told his mother, "I got a magic coin purse." And his mother said, "Oh, well, that's great. How does it work? Show me." "Well, I just turn it upside down and a coin falls out." And he did that. Nothing fell out. He looked in it. He shook it. No coins came out. "It doesn't work. I'm going to go back to the north wind again." So the next morning, Leif got up bright and early. He walked and he walked and he walked, found the north wind, and he said, You blew my flower. Then you gave me a magic tablecloth, which didn't work. And then you gave me a coin purse, which worked once, but then didn't work either. Give me back my flower, please. And the North Wind said, I don't have your flower. I don't have another magic tablecloth. I don't have another magic coin purse, but I do have a magic stick that will help you. All you have to do is say, hit, stick, hit, and it will start hitting whatever is next to it. Well, how will that help me? Said Leif. Are you sure it's going to help me? And North Wind said, yes, it will. And then Leif started thinking, that magic tablecloth worked at the inn, but it didn't work at home. The magic purse worked at the inn, but it didn't work at home. The innkeeper saw both of those things. I think this magic stick is going to work. And so he took the magic stick, and he arrived. He had taken some coins out of the purse and put it in his pocket when he had it, when it was working. So he paid the innkeeper, and the innkeeper noticed this stick and thought, maybe that's magic too. So that night, when Peter went to bed, when Leif went to bed, he did not go to sleep. He stayed awake and listened carefully. The innkeeper snuck into the room, and he saw the stick, and he grabbed the stick, and then Leif sat up in bed and said, hit, stick, hit. And the stick started hitting the innkeeper all over the place, on the head, on the legs, on the rear, on the feet. And the innkeeper said, stop it, please. But Leif didn't say anything. He let the stick keep hitting. And finally, the innkeeper said, stop the stick or it's going to kill me. I'll give you back the magic tablecloth. I'll give you back the magic purse, but please make this stick stop hitting me. And so Leif said, stop, stick, stop. And then he took the stick from the innkeeper, and he got the magic tablecloth, he got the magic purse, and the next morning he went home with all three, and they always had plenty of food to eat, they always had plenty of money, and the stick was ready if it was needed.
Where did you get that story?
There are many versions of it. There are many versions of that story, and I got it from a children's book that was called Peter and the North Wind. And I changed the name, and I also changed some of the story so that it wasn't a complete copy of the book. And the gist of the story is this.
You might want to stick with Peter because you had trouble.
I know. Yeah, Leif is a Nordic name. I think of Peter more as a Russian name, actually, or Slavic name. Petr.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's where I got it. So
We have time for one more.
but we're going to get out.
No.
Okay, can you see yourself?
No, just my hips.
How about that?
That's good.
There she is. There you are.
I want to ask, does anybody know the story about El Cucuy?
No.
Well, a long time ago in the mountains in Mexico, there is the tale that there is a monster in the mountains in a cave, El Cucuy, and he looks like us, except he's bigger and shaggier, and some people said he looked like a shaggy bear. Some people said he looked like a giant. But those who really know that he's just an old man with a back bent crooked as a cedar limb. He has an ear just like we have ears, but he has one ear that's big and red, and it can hear everything. And it can hear when children are not being good. And it's said that he can be asked to come down and take those children away. They talked in the mountains in the village about, you want to see that?
Yeah, that'd be better if we can see your face above the book.
Good idea. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's useful for my storytelling in the classroom as well. Thank you. They talk about the three sisters. Now the father had lost his wife, so he was raising these three sisters by himself. And the youngest was the best little girl you ever saw. She cleaned the house and she always had food on the table when her father came home from work. The two big sisters were just lazy. And they play and play and play. They asked her, "Why do you work so hard, little sister?" She said, "Well, it's hard for Dad because he's all alone trying to raise us now. And so I'm trying to be helpful." They said, "Oh, you're such a goody two shoes. Eres muy tan santucha, goody two shoes." And off they went, chasing butterflies and playing games again. But when the father came home, he would be very upset to hear how lazy the older girls were. And he'd say, "Someday I'm going to call El Cucuy on you." "Oh, Daddy, you wouldn't call El Cucuy on your own daughters, would you?" And they went off and they whispered to each other and they said, "There really isn't an El Cucuy. That's just something that parents make up to make us behave." Well, one day, they not only weren't helpful, they were actually making it harder for the little girl. She had washed her dad's clothing and hung them on the line, and those two big girls went and tied knots in the pants and the sleeves. Well, do you know how hard it is to untie a wet knot? And furthermore, she cleaned the house. It was all clean. Then they went in and took the ashes out of the fire pit and threw them all around. When the father came home, he was furious. And he took the girls by their hand, turned to the mountain and said, "Cucuy, Cucuy, come down here and take these naughty girls." Shook. They were so scared. But then nothing happened. They went out playing again. There really is no Cucuy. It's just something the parents say. But that night, when the sun was turning the sky red, Cucuy came out of the mountain. Everybody in the village grabbed kids, even other people's kids, took them inside to keep them safe. He didn't stop in the village. He walked all through the village and on down the road to where that family was having their dinner. He stepped into the house. He picked up those two older girls and took them away with him. They were so scared. They were so scared. He was taking them through cactus and they were getting all scratched and oh, the tears were running down their dusty face. And he didn't listen. He had that big ear. He could hear everything. "Please, please take us back to our daddy. Please, please." He just kept walking, didn't answer back. Up, up, up into the mountains. And then he put them in his cave, deep down in the dark. Took him up the mountains and put them in his cave, deep down in a hole. The girl said, "Will we ever see our good daddy again? Will we ever see our sweet little sister again?" And when El Cucuy heard them say that, he said, "No, they're glad to get rid of you. Your father and your sister are glad you're gone." Well, it wasn't true at all, really. He just said that to make them feel bad. Because every single day after work, their father had been out looking for them and not been able to find them in that cave deep up in the mountains. Then one day, it was lucky because a goat herd took his goats up into the mountains and he let them play all day long. And then before he went home, he counted them. There was one missing. He had to find it. So he went up, up, up the mountain, up, up, up. And he heard a little bleating sound, And he got closer and it got louder. And sure enough, that little bitty kid had gotten its hoof caught in a crevice. He pulled it out. He hugged it close until it stopped crying. and it was comforted. He still heard some kind of sobbing. It seemed to be coming from under his feet, and he looked down. There were those girls down in that crevice. What are you doing down there? El Cucuy trapped us down here. Please help us get out. The boy didn't have a rope with him, but he did have his jacket. He took it off and he put it down into the cave and helped the girls get out. Oh, they were so glad. He put them on his burro and started walking down the path. But they didn't have far to walk because up coming that very same path was their father and their little sister, the good one. And oh, they each hopped off their burros and they hugged and hugged. And oh, it was so wonderful to be there together again. Daddy, please don't ever ask Cucuy to come take us away again. And he didn't. He didn't have to. Those girls were so good and so helpful and so kind and so friendly and good to everybody. In fact, they say in the mountains still that those girls had children and their children had children, their children had children. And when people go to visit, they say, who are these sweet little kind, clean kids over here in the corner? And the answer is always, those are the great grandchildren of the girls that were taken away by El Cucuy. That's the story of El Cucuy. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. So I think everybody's had a chance to tell a story that wanted to. Is that right? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording. Let's see.